Hello from Maryland Live Casino. Arundel Mills, is that right? Hanover, located in what is basically a shopping mall, but as you can see, a very nice hotel casino property, and I might add, they've really done it. Hospitality, thank you very much, Maryland Live, for this fantastic suite. I've been here once before. It was before I started the vlog. This was maybe 3 to 4 years ago. Came out east, came to grind, came to check out a new casino that I hadn't been to before, and was thoroughly impressed. Last time I was here, tons of action, tons of games in this location. No hotel at that time, but yeah, as mentioned, this hotel about a year old, so. See, you don't really want to have the lighting behind you. Exposure issues, you want to have the lighting. You want to have the lighting in front of you. Okay, so today, another meetup game, but this is not going to be your typical meetup game. No sir, no ma'am. This is going to be the biggest meetup game in the history of planet Earth so far. Take a look at this interest list. Yeah, this is gonna be bananas. This is a very sizable poker room here at Maryland Live. It's got 2 floors, and I think they're gonna give us up to like 20 tables to use. Now, granted, we're gonna need even more than that if everyone shows up, but I don't think everyone's gonna show up at the same time. I think we're gonna open the tables around 3 o'clock. Some people have to work until later. The plan will be, as usual, Brad and I will be sitting at separate tables. We'll be moving tables every hour or so, maybe even less, maybe 45 minutes. Try and play with as many people as possible. We are gonna try and win, but we're also gonna try and just, you know, make sure everyone has a good time here. That's really what these meetup games are about at the end of the day, spending some time with you guys, capturing some footage. I'm gonna try and capture some fun hands. There'll probably be some bomb pots, a couple beers along the way. We'll probably play till like midnight. Should be plenty of time to capture some hands here along the way. Okay, I think I'm gonna fly the drone now and then go get myself a sandwich and then play for 9 hours with 250 people. Hands pretty much literally froze while I was flying the drone out there. Now we're in the poker room, and as you can see, this place is huge. This is the first level, which they basically dedicated this entire level to the meetup games. There's a bunch of empty tables back here for now, but as time goes on, these tables are being filled with meetup game players. So we're playing 3-5. Minimum buy-in will be $200, maximum buy-in $1,000. I'm gonna be in for 1,000, and all these tables will be 8-handed to start, so that should make it easy for Brad and I to hop amongst them and play with as many people as possible. There's already 12 games going. That is easily a record, and we are only like an hour into this event. Should be good times. There's Brad Owen, off he goes to play some poker. I'm gonna go do the same. Let's go. It's a crazy scene here at Maryland Live as new meetup game tables are rapidly opening up. We sit down at our first 3-5 table with our $1,000 in betting discs and take a look at pocket nines. I raise it up to 20 from early on, and the player on my direct left calls while everyone else folds. I've heard this hand makes the most sets.
Nines are the card that make the most sets.
9 on the flop!
So I'm looking forward to this flop. It comes 7-6-5 with 2 hearts. Clearly Scott Seaver doesn't know what he's talking about, but we do flop ourselves and overpair. I bet 25 and my opponent calls. The turn isn't great. It's the 4 of hearts completing the front door flush draw and puts 4 to a straight on board. I check it and my opponent bets 75. I don't want to give it up with the potential that my opponent could be turning some hands into a bluff and us having outs to a better straight, as well as potentially some hearts as backup. I call, and we see a blank on the river. I check again, and after my opponent bets again, I have no choice but to give it up. He shows me pocket fours, so all of our outs were live, including a 9, but it looks like we aren't going to win every single hand today. A few hands later, the cutoff raises to $20 before we get a look at our second pair of the day, pocket queens. I make it $80 to go from the small blind, and the cutoff makes the call. Turns out it's also our second over pair of the day, as the flop comes 7-4 deuce rainbow. It's super dry, so I think we can size down, and I bet $65. My opponent goes ahead and folds, so we're on the board with a victory. We hop into a new table as the number of games for our group jumps to 15. Amazing. Action in this hand starts with an under the gun raise to 15 before the cutoff min 3 bets to $30. We looked at an ace queen offsuit in the small blind. Playing out of position isn't any fun, and we have good removal from strong hands, so I go ahead and put in the 4 bet to $125. I get 0 folds. I love playing out of position. The flop comes king queen 3 with 2 diamonds. With middle pair, I check it, and the under the gun player checks before the cutoff bets $225. I don't want to fold middle pair and some backdoor possibilities, so I call. The under the gun player calls all in for $5 less. The turn doesn't change anything on an offsuit 4. I check it again, and the cutoff jams all in. Since he has no incentive to bluff with the under the gun player all in, we can safely let this one go, and that's what I do. The cutoff shows ace king offsuit, and he's going to go ahead and scoop this one in. Looking back, I still think my 4 bet is generally fine, but facing an under the gun raise and a 3 bet versus that range, I wouldn't completely hate a tight fold. Then again, nobody likes a nit. In this hand, there's a middle position open at $20, and we look down at the best hand ever conceptualized. It's pocket aces. I 3 bet to 60, and the initial raiser calls. The flop comes king 9-6 with 2 clubs, and after he checks, I bet $70. We can get value from any king, any flush draw, and potentially several straight draws, and a lot of other hands will fold no matter what, so there's no real reason to down bet here. My opponent looks at me for a while before deciding to jam his short stack into the middle. It's about $250, which we happily snap call. I go ahead and just roll it over to let my opponent know where he's at. The 5 of clubs on the turn isn't great, and even though we make a set on the river, it's even uglier as it brings 4 to a flush. My opponent waits, and waits a little longer, before revealing the king jack offsuit with a club. That's gonna win. We shake it off and find ourselves looking down at deuces in a 6-handed pot that was raised $15, and things are looking up. We flop bottom set on 9-7 deuce rainbow. Action checks to me, and I bet $40. Not 1, not 2, but 3 people are looking to make the vlog with a call. The turn is an offsuit 4, so we should still have the virtual nuts here. And when it checks to me again, I bet $125. This time there's only 1 non-believer, and the 2 of us see another 7, which fills us up. It's a great card because I should never have a 7 here, aside from when I have 9-7 or pocket 7s, and that just isn't very many combos. It seems more likely that I'll have a hand like 10-8 or 6-8. So I'm going to ramp it up here, and I bet $475. My opponent goes into the tank, and all I'm thinking about is Vegas and the fucking Mirage. Wait, no, I already live there. And the Mirage only really gets $1, $2 games these days. Anyway, after some time, my opponent flashes a 9, and he makes a good fold, sadly. We move over to another game as the table count creeps up to 16 now. The hijack opens for 15 before we look at ace deuce of clubs in the cutoff. He doesn't need to have a real snug range in this spot, so I decide on a 3-bet bluff for $50. The hijack, however, isn't going anywhere, and he makes the call. Heads up to a flop that brings us no equity. Queen, jack 3, all spades. He checks, and I certainly wouldn't hit a check here, but I try and take it away right away with a bet of $55. My opponent still isn't having it, and he makes the call, but I notice that he doesn't consider looking at his cards at all post-flop. It's not a tell that I'll put a ton of weight into, but there is a decent chance that he's suited, having opened and then called out of position pre-flop, and doesn't need to look for spades in his hand. The turn is the deuce of spades, which gives us a meaningless pair. My opponent checks, and I check it back, curious to see what he does on the river. It's an offsuit 8, and he checks it to us again. I'm feeling stronger about my live read and decide to go for it with a bet of $130. He thinks for a little bit before folding and telling me that any spade is good. Pretty sure we didn't have the best hand there, so happy to bring that one home. In this hand, there's a middle position raise to 15, a button 3-bet to $50, and we look down at a super premium in the small blind, 2 kings. Time to unleash some 4-bet funsies, and I make it $170. Only the button calls. The flop looks safe, 10-6-3 rainbow, and I bet $150, which my opponent calls. The turn is the 9 of clubs, which adds all sort of potential to the board. We're about $500 effective on this street, and I think with that amount, a jam makes sense. Any other size would be super small on the river compared to the size of the pot, and if I happen to pick up equity here with a hand like Queen Jack suited or Ace King of clubs, I'd do the same thing. So I go ahead and rip it in. My opponent thinks for a little while before letting it go. Still on the same table now and magically looking at the same hand, pocket kings. I raise it to 20 from early position and only the big blind calls. The flop comes queen 9-3 rainbow, and after the big blind checks, I bet $25. He quickly puts in a check raise to $90. There's only pocket 9s and pocket 3s in the way of sets that should be expected, and queen 9 is likely the only 2-pair combo to consider. We're going nowhere yet and make the call. The turn is the deuce of diamonds, adding a backdoor flush draw. This time my opponent checks. It's a pretty rare sight to face the double check raise, so I'm going to look to charge all of his holdings and bet $160. He lets it go. If we did in fact face that double check raise, I think we would probably be forced to go with it there in that spot. Again, just not enough combos for value on the flop, I don't think, and pocket kings. Nobody likes a nit. Over to a new table now and opening it up a bit with the 7-5 of diamonds to the tune of $20. We see 2 callers. The flop of king queen 10 rainbow isn't exactly in my neighborhood, but nobody needs to know that. It checks to me and I bet $40, which only the big blind calls. Heads up to a turn in which we make a pair. I don't think that's going to be enough showdown value enough of the time, so when the big blind checks, I decide to keep firing in hopes of either folding him out or making 2 pair or trips as a backup plan. Luckily, plan A comes through. My opponent folds. The straddle is on in this hand for some extra fun, and we're looking down at Queen Jack of clubs first to act. I raise the price of poker to $35, which the button and the big blind call. The flop is ultra favorable. We flopped the joint on 10-9-8. There is a flush draw on board, so when the big blind checks, I bet $85, which I think might even be on the small side. There's so many hands that can continue on this board that we can get lots of value from that we might as well just bet full pot. As it is, the button calls and the big blind folds. The two of us see an offsuit 7 on the turn. This time I bet $125, which I think we could probably size up again considering she's never folding a jack and might let a lot of other hands go. She does make the call and we're off to a river, which is a beautiful offsuit 5. We have the nuts through the river and it's time to go for the max. I rip it in for about $500 effective. My opponent goes deep into the tank before ultimately deciding to make the call. Great news, as we know this one is coming our way and things are looking up here at the meetup game at Maryland Live. All right, new table now featuring one of my favorite vloggers out there, Trevor Savage, aka Raising the Nuts on YouTube. The straddle is on and Trevor clearly knows how to have fun. He puts out a blind raise of $20. The player on his left limps in before we look down at 7-6 of spades in late position. I make it $85 to go to try and get after all that money out there and see Trevor and the limper make the call. 3 ways to jack 8-5 with 2 clubs for an open ender. Action checks to me and we have good equity here, which I want to push a bit, and I bet $150. Both opponents make the fold and we scoop it in with 7 high. Shortly after that, it's another straddle pot and we see queen 8 of clubs in late position. We're getting after it again and raise it to $35, which both blinds call. The flop comes 4-4 deuce rainbow with 1 club. When it checks to me, I want to continue representing a strong hand and have lots of turn cards to be able to continue that story on. I can size down while still threatening bigger bets on later streets, so I bet $45 here, but it doesn't come to that and both players fold. Moving over to yet another table as the games list continues to rise. We're up to 20 games, which is just an amazing number to say the very least. The newest table gives me a warm welcome with some White House M&Ms. The welcoming committee is really on point today and delivers me Ace King in early position. I make it $20 to go. There's a call before a late position player makes it an even $100. It's a little tough to get a feel for tables when you're constantly on the move every hour, but I take a look around and I see some drinks on the table. And let's be honest, it's Ace King. It's 4-bet time. I make it $290 to go and the player in between folds. Back over to the 3-better now, who asks how much additional before sliding all of his chips into the middle. I'm feeling a lot less good about it.
All right. I feel like I ran into it here.
But I'm not going anywhere for about $700. We're usually going to be flipping or up against the same hand. Occasionally we'll have 30% equity versus pocket kings, and once in a while we'll be smashed by pocket aces. Turns out, once in a while does happen. We're up against it here with hardly any equity, and we don't get the run out of dreams, and we lose a big pot. I suppose we could flat and get away from it post-flop, but it isn't great playing out of position with a hand that will usually have good equity. And nobody likes a nit. So I'm sure my opponent in this hand loves us. Certainly a little bit frustrating to run into what is definitely a bit of a meetup game cooler here. Ace King versus pocket aces. I think all the money is going to have to just go into the middle. But even though it's bound to happen sometimes, it won't happen that often, and plenty of poker left to be played. Shortly after that, there's an early position raise and several callers before we defend the button with Queen 10 offsuit. We're in position, but it's honestly not a great hand and one that can be easily dominated, so I'm not sure how great the call is, even with some good factors on our side. We're going 5 ways to a flop, though, in which we find an open-ender to the nuts. Action checks to middle position, who makes a bet of $40, which we happily call, getting a great price. The big blind, however, disagrees with that price and raises it to $175. Action folds back to us, and we have no choice but to call and see another card. That card is a bad one. It pairs the jack. We're drawing dead a lot of the time now, and when my opponent bets $225, we have no choice but to fold. We get shown ace-jack, so even though our outs were still live, we had to let it go there. Those White House M&Ms were clearly a trap, and the table is putting tariffs on me left and right. All right, I'm out of there. I'm moving over to a new table now, and action folds over to the small blind, who makes it $15 to go. We look down at pocket nines, and it seems like a strong hand, blind versus blind, so I 3-bet it to $50. The small blind calls, and we're off to a flop of 10-8 deuce, 2 spades. The small blind checks, and a bet is definitely reasonable for equity denial versus overcards, but I take it slow with my middling pair. The turn isn't ideal. It's an offsuit ace, to which my opponent leads out for $60. It doesn't really make a ton of sense because this card nails my range after 3-betting and checking back on the flop. I want to see what happens on the river, so I make the call before we see an offsuit 3. My opponent checks, and I'm happy to show it down at this point. The small blind seems pretty sheepish before announcing absolutely nothing and rolls over the 9-4 offsuit. It's interesting to see this and to highlight a fun aspect of these meetup games, which is that it's really tough to discern what someone is up to and whether they're trying to make a move for the fun of it all, like in this hand, or if they actually have the goods, like in the previous hands. In this next hand, the straddle of fun is on again. The under the gun makes it $25, which is a little on the small side. The player on his left calls, and we look down at ace-queen offsuit next to act. I'd rather get this heads up or win it pre-flop rather than invite other callers in behind me, so I 3-bet it to $100. Action folds to the initial raiser who calls, and the player in between calls as well. The flop comes terrible for us. 8-7-5, 2 spades, 1 club. When it checks to us, I'm basically done with the hand and check it back. However, the turn comes a queen and adds a backdoor flush draw on the board. The under the gun player bets $100, which is barely a third of the pot on a super wet board. The player in between calls. It's a pretty interesting spot because the player under the gun only has about $300 total. If he had a nutted hand, it would seem likely he'd want to protect it with a jam on such a dynamic board. The same goes for the player in the middle who has about $600. With his flat call of such a small bet, it seems very likely that he's drawing, and perhaps even more so than the under the gun player. If we force out the player in the middle, or at least charge him the max, and we run into it with the under the gun player, it's less of a mistake because the under the gun player is relatively short stacked. We want to either get all of the money in now with the player in the middle likely drawing, or force out his equity. Otherwise, he's basically able to play perfectly against us, and he can just fold when he misses on the river. So, all those words in mind, I go ahead and jam all in. And the player who's under the gun can hardly contain his excitement before snap calling. The player in the middle goes deep into the tank for about a minute. He ultimately decides on a fold and said that he has the nut flush draw. We pretty much know where we're at versus the under the gun player in all of his excitement. We are drawing dead as fuck. Tough spot, and he ends up inducing us with his small lead out on the turn. So between that and the board texture, it basically works out absolutely perfectly for him. All right, last table and last hand. Looking to wrap this one up on a good note, and we get a little help in the form of pocket aces in early position. $20 to go, and it folds all the way around to the small blind, who raises it to $50. That's a fantastic sight, and we're looking to build a pot and try and get unstuck, so I make it $160. He thinks for a bit, and then he makes the call. The flop comes favorable for us, possibly too favorable. It's ace queen 4 rainbow. The small blind checks, and we have his calling range almost eliminated, so I check it back. The turn is a jack, and he checks it again, and I want to size down and beg either for a call or an induced raise, so I bet $85. He just calls, which I guess is better than folding. The river is a blank, and he checks it again, and I'm not sure how much value I can try and squeeze out here, but I bet $280. My opponent thinks for a decent while before letting it go. We scoop it in, and we do find at least a good note here on our last of many tables here at Maryland Live.
All right, guys, we're moving on. We're moving over to the center bar here at the casino. Not exactly the result that we had in mind when we dreamt about our first meetup game on the East Coast, poker-wise, that is. But as far as the numbers go in the actual meetup game, the number of tables that we were able to put together, the number of people that came out to play at this meetup game, astronomical. Just blown away by the number of people that are excited for this sort of a poker night, the number of people that are into the videos, so many people, so many friendly faces that we got to meet and chat with and play bomb pots with and lose a little bit of money too. Brad Owens back there somewhere, he won some money for team mugs. And no, we don't swap any action in these games, but just, you know, good for Brad. Yeah, heading over to the bar now, gonna grab a couple beers, decompress, tell some war stories, plan our return to the East Coast in the very near future, I'm sure.